Hello again. I worry I'm perpetually speaking into a vacuum audience of zero, um, but no one can fault me for not trying. So here we are. We are on diagram slash video 4 of the sometimes called metaphysical cartoon, and at other times called the metaphysical comic book, and leaving this ambiguity, or maybe it's a polysemy. That's I just have so much trouble. Polysemy, so much trouble with that word. Benes Seraph, another one. So this refusal to unambiguously name this project by its kind is as much a hedge to my own largely undeveloped, so more tacit. I could express it if pressed, my version of a semantic holism, except mine is going to be paradoxical, and the thesis that motivates analytical philosophy, which is a tool scientists use much more normally, devising their experiments, controls, and variables, but of course they don't see themselves as doing philosophy there, in spite of the fact that they got the methods from this thread of Western philosophy in the first place, because of course, as long as they're quantifying in the numerical, in the number sense, in this case typically with the real numbers, of course, you couldn't possibly be doing philosophy at that juncture. But of course, this is ridiculous. Any conjectural imagination involved in the construction of experiments driven by hypotheses, and the real novel ones, the ones we value, in the future of their confirmation, right? That is just more philosophy, because let's face it, the vast number of scientific philosophies will be disproven or proven in relative error and then debunked. And of course, I am wagging a finger at the special sciences to show itself more accountable to this ongoing replication crisis. So, whether this is an epistemic consequence of our epistemic failures, or a return to all too inevitable forms of human corruption, well, I'll leave you to decide. But I think I am entangling things fatally at the fundamental level, or at least at scale relative points, such that these disentanglings can never be done as logicism supposes. So here is a little over here. Well, I got to go to the reverse. Oh, my hand is in a different place this time. So this diagram. This is diagram 4. But we want to go recap, and of course I seem to be accelerating in the cardinality of my misspeakings, and made several, again, not enough to cause me to want to go through the ordeal of re-recording that video. I'm simply going to make corrections after I do a minimal recap. So as we move forward here, this is going to be the last of the large videos. It might be the longest of all, possibly. I'm very much free balling here, meaning I do have copy, but I will spend more time off script, because the diagrams here are not really of a set with the previous two. They were created in my attempts to contextualize, to metaphysically contextualize my extended, improved definition of life. So I had hoped to use those diagrams in some other project, but that project, um, it had the kibosh put on it, but then that seemed to inspire extending this diagrammatic analysis. So I am now going to look at some of the entailments of these first three diagrams, but now from contexts that are much larger than just trying to pin down the intention with an S here, right? Which you can think of as the set categoric definition, right? Whereas the extension is simply the set of all objects that belong to that set. So let's go back here. So as we roll, wrong way, as we roll right back to where we started, this is our starting point, which is the cosmic cone kludge. All right. So we're going to have a new overriding theme here. So before I review the other overriding themes, because the intent is they're all to be carried forward in your imagination. So this is not a kludge of a project, but it has its own metastructure. And because of my need to create novel terms, because I am arguing for translogical model building, there's just going to be a lot of status quo resistance here. But anybody, I think, who has the epistemic humility to take this work seriously and has the right background is willing to reach out to the author. You know, no one has any interest in having conversations with me. My life is miserable for this. This is an unwanted project for me. So this is a rare opportunity if you are of the same bent, seeing the need for a revolution not only in our values and norms, but one that science has to play a role in it, and understanding and confronting its own dogmatisms and failures to get past these clear loggerheads. It insists on beating its head against, which are the two classical mechanistic, fatalistic, nihilistic, and then these reductive tendencies, the horrors of it all notwithstanding, given our marginal place now on the fringes of a chaotic and disinterested universe, which I'm going to be debunking in effect. We fail to consider that we're at the end of classical science, right? And we need to abandon all the approaches that got us here. My work, because of this, bears ethical weight, and without flouting any sort of is to ought fallacy. I think the internal consistency and coherence of my various interleavings within this non-classical translogical interpretation themselves hold together well in a non-kludgy way. It's the bulk of old chestnut problems that I either sweep aside, correct in definitional or base interpretational problem construction, right? Like, I mean here that there are problems proposed that are on the right track, but they are ultimately poorly constructed. So I'll deal with a relatively new old chestnut. I'd like to apply an interpretive collective along the same lines, right? This orthomaking or orthogonalization. Turning 90 degrees, right? In a metaphorical and literal sense. Here, I'm turning to bring scale considerations and another dimension to the coordinates of the CCK in this new mode, right? I'm expanding the dimensionality beyond the 3 to 4 dimensions of space-time, insofar as it gets compressed down onto this two-dimensional diagram, of course, for people who don't understand all the hidden complexities and derivations and historical work done to end at this, really do risk over-interpreting it, under-determining interpretations in some regards and over-determining them in other regards. So here's our new theme. Okay, there's this impulse to symmetry, right? And this equating of symmetry with beauty as a guide to ascertaining, to judging theories as better and worse. And now this is not quite a naturalistic fallacy, but it risks that, because the argument as to why purely aesthetic concerns should educate in matters of what we assume is pure logical objectivity, I don't think anybody has made that argument, and as such are begging a kind of is-ought fallacy. But I'm going to honor that intuition, poorly justified though it is, and I'm going to, like I take the quantum, the infinite quantum phase space, this unobservable and principled space in which entangled, unobserved systems are said to deterministically evolve. I recapitulate this space. So I'm going to do a similar analogous thing and recapitulate concerns of symmetry, even as I add more things to this dead and mindless take on everything, right? I'm going to start this project of bridging, if only diagrammatically and in these analogical arguments, which will ultimately, the whole weight of this puts a lot of abductive pressure on people who are taking my meaning appropriately to consider the merits of this work further, to help me fund this in some way and get out of this really marginalized and alienated state. I'm not enjoying my time as a philosopher. I did not choose this path, and I have not given up. But this is a Jude the Obscure life, and you need to understand that I don't enjoy it. So this is not a game for me. This is hard. So the assumed impulse to value symmetry is the essential feature of the laws of hard physics in particular would seem to not trump the ad hoc character of the claims made here, right? I am going to make symmetry claims at a novel level, and I don't think objection should arise from that. In fact, this should resonate with this intuition towards seeking out ontological parsimony. This is related to, but I don't think is identical to Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor to me is about chaining unvetted inferences together as much as it is about seeking simplicity. So I don't think those two things reduce to the same referent, if you will, abstract, right? Mythological, mimetic, whatever story of how it is we are guided towards truth. So this argument, this is a very vague reference to all the arguments. This argument is empirically consistent not only with this interpretation, meaning my reinterpretation, this idea that I'm going to provide more parsimony, not less. And the default epistemic valuing, it is meant to abduct, to explain other ungrounded aspects of reality we simply take for granted. It otherwise doesn't seem to apply to, right? So this is the whole idea of the problem of hard reduction to a very strict sort of cleaving nature at the final joints, right? Putting it all into one universalizing theory that builds up the whole of it from this fundamental level. Of course, I've rejected all of this, right? So the theme here again is there's this tendency in classicalism, which I still think infects the status quo in very problematic ways. The Cartesian problems are better recognized, but they keep getting re-invoked. The Newtonian legacy problem, right? This view of space as empty and hostile and pointless, this is all part of the Newtonian legacy as well, with the mechanistic takes, which I think have licensed CTM to do harms greater than this, what I think is nonsense worry about a thing that's not even capable of dying. That's nothing much but a catch all for human bias, right? Getting replicated, getting what's the word I'm looking, rendered onto the vulnerable, right? So I think the harms of technology are well afoot, and I spend no time worrying about sentience in computers, at least as they're currently engineered. And I've written a very pointed paper. My only published paper aims to make a dualized argument, an empiricist and rationalist argument along those lines, and you can find that on academia. So this tendency of classicalism to ignore all the unasked but obviously entailed gaps and other neglected problems of ontology, of metaphysics, of epistemology, is another instance of what I call the liars lying problem, right? It's related to the problem of magical thinking that our leaders seem to favor these days, or what I would call the running marathons in one's head problem. Look, I just set up PB, right? This is the rationalist success too. That we can conceive of or imagine things should not in any way justify existing claims about them, right? But I think they often do, and I think this disease infests Silicon Valley from the top to the bottom, and this is causing us harm. So what are numbers, right? This is the big elephantine problem, right? This is the elephant under the rug sweeping problem of greatest renown, right? The structuralists think they're well on their way, but then they run into a recapitulation of Aristotle's problem when trying to assign essence to a singular monist fundament, right? And I think they're all going to flounder in perpetuity if they only reduce to logics like this. So what are numbers? Not as their vehicles, not as the numerals, which is what I think a lot of lay people and even many non-mathematically inclined academics might take it to be. But I mean, what are the targets of those vehicles, right? So multiply realized across different cultures, yet we know, or at least the evidence would suggest, different choices of symbols to stand as numerals do not undermine the legitimacy of mathematics as the most efficacious tool for achieving epistemic ends, right? And this is the core of science, particularly hard science, right? Because it's the one most quantifiable in the deductive way. Hence the hubris of physicists and the denial of the special sciences as proper sciences on some of their accounts. But I think I think I'm going to invert this little relationship and valorize a biocentric and then a psychological view, but even as I will remain much more of a critic of a lot of the nonsense coming out of the special sciences as well. So there, I think we've lost our fucking minds in places here. So, why, as Wigner quips, are so few not worried that the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics will upset the entire classical logistic quagmire, the one we refuse to free our thinking from, right? And this is especially given the very, very strong confirmation of non-locality and the strength of this confirmation, because it's an inductive claim, because you can't test for non-locality through particulars. You have to do it through statistical ensembles, right? So there's always a door here to reject non-locality on purely deductive terms, but I don't think any of physics is as purely deductive as many suppose. I've argued earlier, I think a lot of so-called deductions have open premise lines, and those aren't final deductions, right? We would expect our toe to be a final deduction. I mean, there is no such thing in my imagination, but this is the hardest thing to prove, these existential negativities, right? How do you prove absences that haven't occurred yet, and can't if it turns out a toe is impossible? And I think particularly the string theorists exploit this bias towards mathematics as epistemically superior, to keep forwarding a project that by many accounts has already failed. And I think it's failed, and I will say more about why it's failing in this diagram and to come. So this is where we start, right? So we're abandoning this, okay? So, but remember, the overriding theme of this diagram is these metaphysical denials that we just refuse to see, like that dog, that nervous dog that won't look at you because then it can pretend you don't exist. Like, this is absurd. This part, I have tremendous faith in content and interpretation to a point. I'll make modifications there. I have. But this, I think, is this kludge part is a bit of nonsense. So for me, looking beyond the CMB is to look beyond, in my sense, in my elided sense, look beyond reality proper, which is an elided reality. And then even, what is or isn't the universe in this account. I can't say at this juncture what this one turning might be, depending on whether you're thinking about it here, or you're thinking about it here or here or here. What you include or don't include in the universe / reality / existence is very unstable, right? Fractal, and paradoxically fractal. So again, this is going to keep popping up. This is I'm honoring the intuition that quantum mechanics is more purely an informational theory, and I'm going to argue for this. It's a biocommunicative theory, at least in the sense of being an unrepresented or endogenous model that must be realized by the first cells in some sense, in an as-if sense, to even begin to live, right? They have to get around the limits of the quantum mechanical analysis, but not in an a prior or necessary sense, in a Kripkean necessarily contingent sense. So this Easter egg will keep showing up. So then we will recap diagram 2, right? And here the theme to keep carrying forward. which I think is a radical reinterpretation. I'm amazed no one has considered this. It's just lying right there. It's lying right there in one of the informal, empirically centered derivations. I mean, it just seems no one has considered this. And if you do, it changes everything. And so I should be allowed the epistemic charity here to not violate Occam's razor, but to state my if and develop my thens. As long as I'm not chaining more of these reinterpretive base points together, I am creating an if-then model as a hypothesis in that sense, and that's okay, right? That's how, in meta logic, we cash out the very our ability to prove models through inference, right? So I'm not asking for anything more than that. So there's no seeing is on Kripkean necessarily contingent terms ever possible below the scale of the atom. Well, then all these questions about observation, whether what's going on below the scale of the atom, become moot. It's just contingently necessary that there is no seeing. So there can't be observing. There can be detecting and as if detecting, and at some point you're not even detecting things that could ever exist naively to perception on any terms. You're conceiving of beables, and it's not going to stop there, right? This is where we're heading in the next diagram, to the final correction of this giant, illogical, irrational elephant that we keep tacitly endorsing together as we destroy ourselves by killing life because we think computers are the thing that are going to evolve. It's absurd. I don't understand how people can believe such absurd things. Lay people, yes, but intelligent people believe this nonsense. I hardly feel this is as rational a species as advertised. Anyways, I will try to keep the ranting to a minimum. So, this is right here, this whole thing. This is the same scale for the emergence of life, right? And of the vitally endogenous but unrepresented in the semantic sense inner model of quantum mechanics. One of my radical hypotheses, right? Later I say conception is the same relativity is the same model now, an exogenous one, because we represent it and couldn't possibly have that as an exogenous model. Endogenous. Our endogenous model is Newtonian, right? We intrinsically intuit Newtonian mechanics. That's why we can ride bicycles in the first place as minds, right? And this is also right here where new senses of causation. This is who's my favorite philosopher of who went to U of T? My goodness, why can't I remember his name? Bertrand Russell. My God, senior moments abound for me today. Rainy Sunday day, not a lot of enthusiasm. I normally do this on Saturday, but it's the long weekend. Bertrand Russell, no causation. But then also we get these like roughly 3 times dispositional, counterfactual claims, interventionist. I mean, there are others, but this is over here. It's about the symmetry, isn't it? So causation is replaced by symmetry and the implication of the relations of symmetry to specific laws of conservation, which are those laws that don't mesh well with the second law, yet we want them all to be laws on the same universalizing and fundamental. No. If you're not already with me to a certain extent, I mean, I can't convince you, and I just feel that you're a Kripkean dogmatist at this point, and are probably watching me just to get angry at what I'm saying. So there's a dogmatism that has taken over rationality on this planet. I mean, The Walking Dead, the TV show, was a warning, and just like a lot of people think the situation described in 1984 in the book 1940 has already taken root, right? We're going to talk later about multiple realizability. So I think in 2016 the universe took a bad turn. It tipped. And then all I can think about is it tipped towards evil, because it tipped away from contrition, accepting culpability, and facing the reality that we have so mistakenly, with the best of intentions, created to our own increasing detriment every single day. And I see no sign of the collective epiphany yet. And I live in terror for this beyond my shitty life. I guess this is the slide full of swear words. Anyways, so there we are. We're not going back ever again to the CKK. The two classically kludged together cone of the cosmos. But this slide, of course, we should return to, because it is the visual metaphor for the three tripart, the novel fractal, non-classical way. I differently parse these, right? And of course, we'll quickly go through all this stuff, right, to no great end, and there we are. So, and then of course that led to my two-part, but really we want to internalize this reinterpretation by imagining my model and the way this diagram represents. So the first was to orthogonalize, right? To make scale the primary axis of ontological / metaphysical / epistemic concern. And then to add in this, very scandalous and, of course, radical and likely to be dismissed out of hand claim that I think the reality that we're only observing into difference. So we are getting something from it, from the gunk universe, the pre-seen, the pre-observed, the pre-detected universe, which is this level down, fully outside of itself gunk universe, right? But I'm saying that the quantum mechanics, the quantum mechanical tipping to life created openings in this degraded but infinite, right down to the bottom scale of what I call the quantum holism. Now it's going to suffuse up, right? This is a fractal boundary, so I still need to do these classical analysis, or else people will just not be able to grasp the subtleties and shift of the interpretation, because I guess it is three-part, right? It's the ortho part, which is why in this diagram I do it by talking about this, and only then the one-to-many step. And this is about me rejecting the claim that logic is representationally neutral. So knowledge has a shape, and where is it shaped? Well, it's out there in the world, right? Like, if you're remembering or knowing something and you're doing it truly, veridically, then your perception, and here I'm not talking about your senses, but your perception, your non-conscious perception, is in a sense oriented towards where that object actually is right now in the block universe, right? And on this, memories will become a form of conception. Oh, I just solved another old chestnut problem. What is memory? This is a huge unanswered question, and I'm going to say it's a non-conscious perception which transcends dated notions of the space-time whole, right? So invoking a block universe. So when we see memories of the past, we are literally looking sometimes to objects that still exist. So if we orient properly, perhaps like the Muslims seek to face the Mecca, this is not an insignificant thing to do if it helps us orient to the truths. Our engagement with memories, or the what's it called, the Kabbalah, this black rock that is a meteorite the Mecca, in Mecca, right? Excuse me if I trample on things that I'm not an expert in here, and I misrepresented aspects of the of Islam here. That's not my intention to be critical, but to draw these analogies in support of this this mandate to face the Mecca, right? So I would say, non-consciously, in a Zen sense, if you want to remember well or understand well, believe that knowledge is out there. It's part of the structure of space-time scale, right? Because there's so much empty space in spite of this superficial appearance of impenetrability that we get from our bias towards electromagnetic, surface interaction, which is not a universal form of impenetrability. The universe is very impenetrable by bosons, by neutrinos. So, again, this is this gravitational electromagnetic bias that we find ourselves in this rare place. But I don't think we've confronted those biases. All right, so let's go on to the misspeaking. So again, here, what motivates this reinterpretive step is the overriding theme: no seeing possible. So no observing. Why are we arguing about what's going on below there? There's no point. There's no seers, no possibilities of seeing. So observation couldn't exist in the gunk universe, right? Okay, misspeakings. Wow. Okay, I really fudged a lot of things up. At one point, I inverted classical and non-classical, and that must have been confusing. That I said I was taking the non-classical to the classical. So hopefully you glossed that, right? That's not what I'm doing. I'm taking non-classical, on the ground status quo, buried, tacit, ridiculous elephant under the rug problem, classical CCK, and I'm replacing that with something very different. The problem of naming century. So, philosophy, the modern period to a philosopher, to a scientist, is in the 16th century, larger Bacon, Descartes. So this is a legacy problem, and in part explains why in North America and anywhere that this problem persists, kids struggle with math. Apparently, one of the reasons Asian kids do better, particularly the Chinese, is because the way they name the numerals provides extra information about place value. But that doesn't happen in the numerals of English speakers, which are a kludge of numeral names from other languages. And so the structure of naming in no way is consistent with the structure of construction, of place spell construction, which is really a form of compression. Let's not forget. It's base 10 compression going on, right? And there we are, the informational take again. So here's the problem. The first century, in my take, if you believe that 0 is the right placeholder for all originations, which it doesn't matter if it isn't or isn't, we should be consistent in our infrastructural conventions here. But really, the idea of locating the 0 point on Christ's archetypical, like made up mythological birth, that he was born in the summer, not Christmas, was chosen to compete with all the non-monistic takes, right? The people who still believed in power, gods, and spirits and magic. You wanted to supplant their tradition. Whoop. So largely we're talking about the solstice, right? Here. So, that's the 25th is really originally was chosen because it's the solstice, the change in and increasing and decreasing daylight. So this was propaganda by the church. Anyways, so the first century, it could be said to start at the birth of Christ, but that's not how we ended up doing it. So the first century, starts at the end of 100 years, right? The first century starts at 0, and the second century starts in 100 years. But that's not what we've done, because we've made the 0.1 in a sense, right? Just like apartment buildings, right? Why is the ground floor called the first floor? If we wanted our children to do better at math, we would get them to understand that the plane of the ground is the 0 point. And so that's the 0th floor, starting at 0, but we call it the first floor. And confusion, I think, abounds because of that. It would be good were we to fix that. So I'm going to make mistakes here. So, for example, 1890 is the late 19th century, and I'm sure I screw this up, but it's not important, really. But I did realize I may have been inconsistent here. Now, at one point I said an elided definition of perception. No. I haven't defined perception at all. What I've elided is the definition of reality. I've geometricized it. And I found a third way, right, between the law. I think the problem is not that the intuition to define and seek a reality based on naive perception is the wrong way to go. We have to honor the lay tradition. But it doesn't work. Mind independence doesn't work, right? This necessary supervenance on matter might turn out very problematic, particularly because we can imagine things that don't exist and then create them. But sometimes what we imagine could never be created. It's impossible. So it's the definition of reality I'm making, and that document appears on Academia if you're interested. It's very preliminary. Okay, and I have a lot of trouble saying dynamisms, but I think that's the right word because it's dynamic is the adjective. So the objective, the objective suffixing is dynamism, right? So I'm talking about all of the dynamics exhibited, so it's a more general claim about all of the things the organism does and may do. So it includes the dynamisms of potentiality, I would suppose. So I said at another point I was talking about absolutes and how we can, I was talking about absences. See, I'm just making the same mistake. Absences and how we can perceive them. So there is a sense in which real nothings are perceivable, but this is very different from making the claim that the Big Bang is a real nothing or that 0 is a real nothing. And I think those concepts are all tied up with infinity in these inversions. Then finally, in my pair analysis of change, right? I think any A to B kind of attempts made to reduce change to within the same level, the ontological level of reality in observational terms, this is not going to work. It will invoke the Parmenidean problem in perpetuity. I think it still applies. So I also assimilate this problem in a way to resolve that, or to begin to resolve that on this diagram, right? Because I am in effect saying whatever's going on in the A to C realm, like when A gives up some of its matter, energy, some of its form and substance necessarily because of conservation, because of finiteness in what we call the at least the observable universe, because that's the premise we're still defending, and I am to a certain extent. But because of that, I don't think any A can go to any C in any way just in reality. It has to evolve. The real arena, if you will, of change is a paradoxical and forever unobservable one. And where real change, I think, goes to happen is back into the quantum holism in this sense. So I screwed that up. I did actually write the F word, but I don't want to. I want to use swearing for effect, and not just because I'm in the mood. So I had many cases where I fucked that up. The A through B to C parametaphor change, right? So I kept saying A to B, so I'm just correcting that here, right? Okay, what did I say? Ontologically, right? Yeah, so I think we need a pre to post ontological kind of analysis, a logical analysis to ever account for change, and then it becomes three-part here, right? But again, this is just to keep assimilating these old chestnuts and show how these added interpretations are not only consistent with my reinterpretation. I'm linking together so many solutions here that, again, this is low-hanging fruit. I think my whole model is low-hanging fruit, and I'm astonished why I can't get a single person to take it seriously. So I kept saying A to B, but that should be A to C through pre-ontologically to post-ontologically through B star, right? And I said the relata of A to B, same thing. A to C, A to C, A to C. So hopefully those things were glossed okay, but if they weren't, you could go back and hopefully these corrections would guide you through those stumbles. Let's hope I don't continue this trend of misspeaking more. It's on an exponential curve, it seems. I should have said locus, not loci. I was talking about a single point, not a collection of points, minor thing. The book I was referring to was by Peter Carruthers, and I might bring him back, not Robert Cummings, but Robert Cummings is also important in the background in my work because his interpretation of intentionality in regards to computers supports my debunking of CTM. So Peter Carruthers was the book, right author I was referring to. And I think at one point I misapplied the knowing that versus knowing how in terms of, and here, this is the recapitulation from existence, non-existence, and the quantum wave function insofar as it would be seen as coming out of the Big Bang. That's a real uber universal wave creation. That's not what I'm proposing. Then there's this recapitulation at the emergence of life through the endogenous model realized in the DNA and the developmental machinery of what I think is the accidental universal wave function, the one pre-entangled by cells, but still effectively occurring in an infinite space. Like, so it's occurring below the scale of the atom and just emerging into the scale above, which is reality as perception, non-conscious to begin, and then that's a spilling over again. And this is where Carruthers is saying there is no amodal space for reasoning. His model, his thesis is that conception is sensory based in its entirety, and that propositions in amodal content can't be expressed at all. They have to work non-consciously behind the scenes to invoke the sensory systems, the perceptive systems. Sorry, and I think he's right in the first part and wrong in the second. And this is where I can correct this. I believe the knowing hows are done more in the way that CTM and Marr inspired visual science, cognitive science is now producing results to say how it is the neural structure and function does abstract that part of reality that does reflect something of the essence of matter as a ding in such. But of course, where it's going to get in trouble is with Donald Hoffman's take, which is that because natural selection, Darwinian selection would not seem to need to choose absolutely to see the world as it is, just essentially enough such that its hacks become more effective. And such, this then is the idea of things like secondary qualities are being projected back onto matter. So where is this realm? Well, I believe this is exogenous, and this is where I would disagree with Carruthers. There is a translogical amodal space, and this only comes out if you look at my larger model. Particularly the linchpin is the video called The Fracture, which I actually did before this 7 diagram inspired take. So I wasn't very clear about that either, or I misspoke in a way. Knowing that endogenous, the evolved part of the computational aspects of the in-house neuronal, the evolved functional capacities. I'm going to say there's an exaptation, a spandrel here that leads to this exogenous, which is the amodal workspace, but also a recapitulation again, the third time, to a quantum phase space. This time the one that serves mind. This is where our thoughts get all entangled and arise. This is another quantum phase space. How could we not see this is true? This is awful that that no one has these obvious insights but me. It's horrifying. And I lost the thread. I was talking about Wittgenstein. So this thing I'm borrowing from key philosophers who are not normally associated with this, because I'm very much embedded as a neo-empirist. I'm very much an analytically inclined, scientifically grounded. I'm no armchair. I mean, I'm in an armchair. But my intuitions never get so far away from the lay intuitions, from the experiences from which that we forget motivated all these downstream, exogenous, represented models of mathematized science. I think are always abstractions of unrepresented, endogenous modelings that are realized in the structurings and functionings of life and mind itself, right? So I lost the thread on Wittgenstein. We should not expect to find final experiences in the model, was again the point I forget to make. I think he said that by leading us to water without speaking of the water, because had he, we would have nothing left to drink. And this is his notion of use going to surface, right? The meanings are on the surface. And the farther you go in interpreting them, the farther you get away from their essence and use, is I think what Wittgenstein was not saying in his metaphorizing, in his many whimsical thought experiments. No more or less whimsical, I hope, in the end than mine are. Right? And this is Wittgenstein the second. We bring the intrinsic hidden structure back to the intrinsic other to self in that moment of going beyond experience to interpretation, which for us humans, when we're talking, we don't see that gap. But there is a gap. Just say a word over and over and over and watch it lose its semantic assent and go back to just a nonsense sound. And the fact you have to go to such efforts to destroy this arbitrary connection between symbol and referent, or symbol and meaning, shows how important that these links are maintained. But they are maintained in the sense that you can loop a bunch of knots together and look like there's one big knot, but there isn't a knot at all as you pull one knot out from inside the other and find yourself back with a string, like some kind of magic act, right? And of course, this is how some rope tricks are in fact done, right? It appears there's a knot when there isn't one. And I think this is a good metaphor for what Wittgen II was doing, right? So, this hope is to, in this moment, transcend ourselves. But we keep wanting the illusions of certainty control over accepting experience without the imposition of our clearly biased and hidden biased need to value only in human perpetuating terms, largely, right? We seem to fail in large part to being re-guided by the lived meaning of it all, right? And as they talk about being present, being in the flow state, right? We seem to forget this. It seems to me that meaning, this unanalyzed lay notion of meaning, emerged exactly to set us on a better course. But we don't seem to want to choose that, and instead to pursue the illusions of certainty and control will destroy ourselves. And we'll call that final epistemic progress, I guess. This is not only madness at some point, it's the manifestation of evil incarnate, right? Let's not be hyperbolic, but the plight of humanity is reducing into a battle again between good and evil, if only because we fail to confront reality at all lately. So, there's our recapitulation, our corrections, and of course our this is the Easter egg about information. So instead of going right into the copying content and diagram here, we're going to have another interlude of the sort we had previously, where I'm going to extract copy from another work to introduce this background problem with the live problematic analysis of the concept information, right? Because many assume, or might assume, this is already a semantic term. But it's not, and Shannon took great pains to make that point. I think it would be better had he called it data. So I'm going to do a little time travel here before I start this latest side exegesis. Okay, did you notice the time travel spontaneous Easter egg there? I'm having fun time traveling. I may break this video up into two. We'll see. We're already an hour in, so maybe I'll get through this information and call this part A of video 4, and then pick up the thread and maybe spend a little more time, because I'd like to touch on fluidity here, like the part of this project is to, again, to show what I think are the sort of right epistemic paths that we're on, and to make sure that I can bring together some of these disparate theoreticians in ways that support this reinterpretation, right? And this is much to defend the methodological aspect of pluralism in its institutional form, right? I feel we are all working in these silos, and our language has become so specialized. It's a miracle we can talk across disciplines at all, like even within different aspects of physics, right? You know, do the those who work in general relativity and quantum mechanics, are their terms copacetic, or have they become incommensurate? You know, the failure to integrate. I think there most people would have the cross expertise. I'm a little more comfortable in quantum mechanics than relativity, but that's largely because I didn't learn tensor mechanics, so that limited my ability to understand the theory. So I'm left with metaphors and these memes, you know, like the universe is a thing with its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere. What I add, of course, is that center that you pick is always a recapitulation to the Big Bang, and as such is a negative origin. It's an absence, not an absence from all of what exists or all of reality or all of being, but an absence from reality. And it is, in fact, in this metaphorical sense, the empty recapitulates the empty essence of all concepts, right? Just to represent that all these laudable classical divide and conquer derived concepts that we then seek to analyze out by providing intentions, right? Definitions, categorical or otherwise, lots of ways to define, such that we can unambiguously, in a functional, not a relational way, determine set membership, right? So that's the extension. Now I forgot where I started. Oh, that's just awful. Let me pause again and give me a moment to find my place. All right, there, yeah. So, you know, if there is a word, and a very important word in philosophy and science across many disciplines, that's more poorly reconciled than information. As much for the unfortunate misnomer, some regret. I forget who which of the giants of quantum mechanics, of the era of quantum mechanics, suggested to Shannon that he equate his theory of information with entropy too, right? So you know, there's a lot of kludging and incommensurate in this term, and so this analysis that I'm going to provide from my placeholder PhD thesis called Lost in Representation is just another one on the pile. And the interesting thing in terms of this first half of this video, because I am going to definitely break it up, is that at the end I'm going to tell you that my interpretation is wrong and why it's wrong on the way to not only completing the diagram for content and copy, but to set up the final series of diagrams, which will be done in a more compressed way. So let's just get on with that. Remembering in the background, whatever you think information means, there's no guarantee that this meaning is shared, even with theoreticians within your own disciplines or close to them. So this is just my attempt. and it came out of the concern that there's a lot of residual polysemy and ambiguity in use of the term. And this is very problematic given how important information is to these theorists and how important Shannon's theory of data is. Right? I'm going to try to make those corrections. So, physical information is a misnomer. Any use of the term information applied to any quantified sense is at best colloquial, metaphorical, and misinformed. A misnomer. And I find it surprising that this use has not been better corrected, or no concerted attempt has been made, given how often authors from a wide range of disciplines come to this conclusion. This equivocal use invites the largest source of semantic confusion and affords many tacit paths for smuggling in intentional talk. And here I mean a talk where it's somehow begged that the problem of original intentionality is solved along the way of this discourse around physical information, right? So many paths for smuggling in intentional talk in ways that are begging the question without even knowing you've begged the question. This is a pernicious kind of theorizing, and I think it from bit theorists or people who want to make information the fourth state of fifth state. This is not. This is to fail to understand that information is an entirely an abstract encoding of representational meaning, and you can't have or collate or quantify or mathematize physical information without there being supervenance on matter. So this idea that it's massless or the fifth, I think it's because they're ultimately making this mistake I'm talking about here. So I use the term data, single quote, data, when it is not clear use of information. Information means physical information. Physical information is not semantic on Shannon's terms. All quantified forms of information, right? So now, air quotes means I'm talking about this problematic term. So who knows what I mean when I say information? Who knows what anybody means? Some people would take false information to be information. This isn't going to work for Dretsky, and it's not going to work for me, although it might work for Flaherty. I'm not sure. So all quantified forms of physical, Shannon's information, are just forms of data. And they can be further subcategorized at some level within the analysis of data. And let me just do this quickly since I'm going to break this video up. So Flaherty is the only one I know who offers a clear analysis of physical information as data, and here he embeds it in the matter in terms of the datum being a foreground element that is being encoded or captured in some way, in the way Shannon meant to do it, and where the background is just simply everything that isn't the datum. And then you get into the problem of what is the abstract, so what is a pure difference. And here Flaherty proposes datomina. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that interpretation is right or wrong, but it's certainly inconsistent with some of these it from bit takes. Now, the other thing I think Flaherty does different is most people would encapsulate information as a content that, when interpreted, must be true, right? So this is semantic information. So that means false data could never be information. Now, I think Flaherty inverts this. I think he wants to reverse this. So he wants to embed. He wants to make the larger thing the data, and then the truth, or is it the other way? It doesn't matter. He's an idealist, so he's a monist idealist, and his views are as far away from mine because I'm endorsing some of the classical metaphysics along the way, right, to debunk it. So I'm working in the monist realist assumption. In no way am I invoking any sort of idealist takes, but really this is a part and parcel of understanding the bad and good uses of the concept information. At some point you have to turn to Flaherty's interpretation of information, even his little tiny shrunken monograph or his massive logically complex work, The Philosophy of Information, which I labored through painfully, not understanding the bulk of the advanced logic and metalogic he was presenting there. Anyways, that's right. So the physical embodiment of data is about nothing but some prohibitive, trivial, and wide disposition to inform, non-consciously or otherwise. So this is why you can't assume the semantic part is included in any ongoing technical definition of information. You have to look more closely at their entire analysis to see where it's grounded, as to whether they recognize this problem at all. So this includes this disposition to inform, natural disposition, any kind of stored information on a computer or on a piece of paper, right? So the difference here is in the location, means for, and depth of access to the interpretive systems fit for these different forms of data. So computer information is just uninterpreted data when it's stored, and it has to go through the peripherals in some way and being logically reconstructed according to the program, right, according to the debug, the ideal program. And then finally there's another level, like that's a reconstruction, then a decoding. It's not an interpretation, but it's a recreation for a renewed interpretation by a human, right? By a vital mind. And the page is doing something simpler. It's just as the encoding is on the surface and the decoding is endogenous. It's our innate language skill. And again, here we go. I'm going to debunk innatism, right? Because they want the language facility to be part of the endogenous neural knowings. How? And I think it's part of the spillover. I think the reason we can learn languages so effortlessly is because we're actually working in a recapitulated third order quantum phase space, the one in which mind operates, right? So intentionally re-encoded information becomes data again until it's reinterpreted. And this is something the problem of we interpret language so seamlessly we don't feel we're interpreting at all, and this creates a bias around on how we interpret when we're dealing with data or semantic information in other guises, and I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion here. So this encoded data loses its intentional import, but for the persistence of all the non-accidental background conditions of both the encoding system and the environment, right? It depends for its persistence, for the possibility of becoming semantic information again, for its persistence and maintenance on culture, technology and minds more so than on anything Shannon had to say. See, the problem with Shannon's theory is he assumes that the language in the background. So the problem of the model on which data is reliably communicated does not answer the question about language at all, the one we need, the symbol grounding question, right? So, and this is Dretsky, information is ordinarily understood as three essential properties. It is an intentional, a semantic entity, right? So this is not Shannon here. Two, it is true. And I'm going to strongly endorse this claim, although I think Flaherty has a different approach here because of the idealism, perhaps. And three, it is transmissible, which is to say it can be communicated. And again, the question as to whether non-conscious communication is semantic is going to await us soon. So anything that lacks one or more of these properties isn't information. And so this led me to start in my attempt to naturalize data, not semantic information, on the way to solving the problem of original intentionality, as I attempted in my master's paper, right? So I then coined this notion of true information, which I called tinformation, right? Whimsical, but on the mark. So misrepresentation, again, Dretsky, who should guide us well, even for the things he's turned out wrong about. Misrepresentation is a species of representation, but information is not like this. So misinformation is not a piece of information of the false variety. It is not information at all, right? So original intentionality and the problem of semantic assent are already being brought into the same neighborhood here by Dretsky. So this is what I call tinformation. Dretsky. This is Dretsky's nuclear sense of information, right? It's close to the colloquial sense, the informal sense, the information, the use of the term information with an added rider, right? It's not just Shannon's information, so it's not just data, but the right data to be interpreted has to be there. Now, there's multiple realizability, but it will remain data if what is interpreted turns out to be some propositional content that in fact turns out false on rationalist or empiricist grounds. Then even on interpretation, you just have more data, right? So this is the interesting part of this analysis. So it's not just data if it turns out on interpretation to be false. It can't become information. It covers a spectrum from passively interpretable through actively interpreted to just interpreted data, often intended in the sense it means its means for decoding is right on the surface. Right? Somebody gives you a false phone number, they're not giving you information. This is coming up. And so the idea is the informee, the person being informed is already actively engaged with the data or has easy access or ownership to it. I mean, we're awash in near infinite amounts of data, and this is part of the problem of why we need to hack reality as much as perceive it as it is, because we couldn't possibly process all the data that's impinging on our sensory registrations and in non-sensory ways just by being embedded in vibrations and forces and light and all that, because that impinges on our body in lieu of our ability to parse it at the microscopic and at hierarchical levels above that. So we shouldn't be surprised that we have to hack reality given this interpretation alone. All right, so this is what am I talking about? So we can now, and this is real information, right? This is perceptive. This is where we start, the unity of naive experience. So we can retrieve information, semantic information about the weather just by looking outside, whether we express it or not. I think when we see it's raining, we are informed by the fact of the rain falling on us, whether we say that or experience that or not. So something is in this possibly pre-semantically informed, although the simple saying I'm getting wet might be a confirmation that you have been informed. You have interpreted that information based on your naive experience of the wetness, and that the likely source of it, given the state of the clouds all black and whatnot, and the streamings of rain coming down, played a role in you abstracting that information very naively, right? Right? Or just by looking outside, or how we can find a specific building from an address, but here the problem of spoofing, right, of lying is lurking in the background. I don't think if the rain in this sense can conspire to lie to you about its ongoing raining on you in the way conventional things like addresses fall prey to this, accidentally or otherwise, through malice. So often when people use the term colloquially, they mean the nuclear sense. So they mean all the senses potentially, and they may not even be clear that they should be disambiguating senses here, Freudian or otherwise. But just as people often fail to appreciate the difference between what they believe and what they know, they often fail to appreciate the difference between information and data, physical information, right? So consider this case. An English-speaking detective is handed 3 pieces of paper, each with the purported location of the murder weapon. The first is in English and contains the true location. The second is in French, which the detective knows nothing of but for the alphabet, right? He shared alphabet. And it contains the true location. Now the third one is in both English and French. They both say the same thing, but now they say false, so they misdirect you to the wrong location. Okay, so this first note, when you read it, the English one becomes tinformation. The second note remains mostly data, even though it's the same proposition, because it can't be interpreted, right? Because he doesn't have the code for French. He doesn't have that endogenously. He hasn't multiply realized particular linguistic capacities here as is possible, right? So all one perceives is the right alphabet, but the wrong encoding. Perhaps it is better to say one perceives a mix of data, interpreted meta information, and uninterpreted information. Now, the third note contains some information, but not as normally supposed. As the proposition on the piece of paper is false, there is not information to be interpreted here as the content, right? What's in the vehicle, which in this case is letters of a language. I mean, there never was, because of the intent to deceive. There is only data masquerading as truth. The tinformation possibly gleaned in this case is what the French sentence means, and that it's false, not what the proposition represents. So this is a meta interpretation, right? So so this is a complication, right? There's not data or tinformation in some finite way, like in a logicistic way, as hope, because every object that's well bounded enough to be called a system, say, if it undergoes a determinal state transitions at some scale or level of abstraction, right? we could call it a dynamic object. And it is much harder to rule things out of this extension than into them. So these dynamisms in the systems around us are the basis for this disposition to inform in natural terms, right? So because of this, because of the mind independence, because we'll go back in time, and there was a time before mind existed. So there's no possibility of this interpretation, like extracting fully semantic information, but there's the vital possibility, right? And even that the DNA is a semantic system, and therefore it extracted some data on its way to endogenizing this model of original perception that the first cell realizes. So because of this, to understand this process of naturalism through the mind absent and vitality absent phase of the universe to the only vital phase to the vital and minded phase that we have now here, right? That I decided to treat all of the data prior to vitality and mindfulness as its own time indexed, right? So it's an indexical kind of information here relative to a time of emergence, but only in regards to the foliation produced with Earth as the point of relativization, right? Back relativization, retroductive. And so this was this idea of data disposed for original intentionality. Because the idea is before life, there's no possibility of any sort of semantic assent. And I'm partially with Burge that perception marks that point in which of the first semantic, a non-conscious and intentional semantic assent. But I want to talk about that point before. What is, like, I want to talk about life stepping into this background of all this data disposed for original intentionality, right? So these DDFOI are the basis for defining environmental information, which helps in our analysis to produce a kind of natural meaning. I'm gonna. There's a whole bunch of famous papers in the background here by Grice, right? That inform this analysis. So the original account of natural meaning taken from Paul Grice, I believe it's Paul, is reinterpreted and narrowed by Dretsky as environmental information. And I'm again leveraging that somewhat. The ultimate source of the data disposed for original intentionally rests with the right analysis for data. So this is, under the surface here, you need to consult with Flaherty. It's on SEP, his analysis of data in this sense that I'm proposing here, where datum is a foreground moment of encoding abstraction from something supervening on matter as a well-bounded system or object, and where the background is as much a part of determining what the datum is as the foreground is. And this leads to further analysis of datumina, which, of course, because he's an idealist, that's how he's going to go. And now we have other people proposing information as another state of matter, and boy, these are incommensurate analyses. And again, I'm not going to either of those. I am taking the middle path, right? But at least this data is natural, right? It's not adulterated. Not all the data is adulterated by our imaginations, our cultural imaginations. Is there any natural data in the way there would have been before there was living life? I don't think so. And this is part of what I'm arguing for in a much bigger scale here, right? Um, so it's natural data. So it's non-derived and physically realized, supervenient on matter, and therefore fodder for naturalism and even reductive forms of materialism, right? I'm with Dretsky here to a certain extent. So let's consider another more problematic case, because this is the one that I made and the one that ended up undoing and causing me to reject my entire naturalistic analysis as absurd. So these DDFOI are the basis. Consider another case. A woman gives a guy her phone number. Classic story. He types it into his phone, which synchronizes with his Gmail contacts. But then he loses his phone. Wow. So there's all sorts of interesting questions here. Does he have information about this woman on his computer hard drive as a consequence? I mean, he certainly has some derived data. This is not the natural data. This is human constructed. So the whatever intentionality or semantic consent is tailed here is not prior to life or mind. That's why it's derived as opposed to naturally disposed, right? So it's non-natural. It was meant to inform. Unlike animals can learn to run away from fire without needing to have culture, just needing to have been burned by hot things that have flames coming off of them one time, if this isn't already genetically embedded in some behavioral sense. Right? The source of the data here and its disposition to inform is non-natural. It came from human intentions, right? Way up the chain of semantic intent. So, but this number may be isomorphically and functionally encoded as a bit string and variously replicated and transmitted from lost. Thank God he lost his phone. We would have had a different story of him trying to find this woman having lost her number. But that's not our story. But even if he turns the computer back on and types the reinterpreted number, now purportedly as information because it's a live phone number, he's experiencing the information he's about to type into his new phone dialing pad. It's just going to turn out to be data again because, hello, Joe's Pizza, may I take your order? So this is a deeper problem than the early problem, right? So in seeming contradiction to what I just claimed above, I said he finally has some tinformation, but the tinformation is not the tinformation he thought he had. He was wrong about that. When he interpreted this thing that went through a bunch of Shannons and codings thankfully to finally be retrieved from Google servers for him to type into a phone as a piece of information tied to this woman. Oh my God, she lied. The woman lied. That's the only information or tinformation gleaned here. So the problem is it's in different states here. And yet, is it the same information? I don't know. I think this is a problematic analysis and shows the problem with proposing a singular a moment in universal development of semantic assent. Instead, I think there's going to be many of them. But the nature of a semantic assent realized at one level for one object of sentience is going to ward off ever being able to appreciate that these assents are happening all over the place. And perhaps I'm in this invoking some kind of panpsychism, but maybe not. So really all he had was that data disposed to become information that never would, right? And he had some other less useful data and the hope, but this this has nothing to do with the information he thought the phone number represented because he was lied to. He still has that data. And that information he only assumed it provided is not what he expected to be. Even though the woman did this intentionally, she was not for this communicating either. And this leads us to complications, right? See, it is very, very complicated. Data can't be false, but it can't be true. But it can be encoded and decoded in lossless or lossy ways. And that's what Shannon was able to give us a quantified model of. But neither can information, right, be false, but on different terms, on post-interpretive terms, on post-semantic consent, particularly of the humankind. So, but intentions, justification, and fallibility are a big part of saying whether any meaning is faithful. If this faith is justified, then data derived from a meaning can inform and may become information. And these are separate steps, right? This is the fact that they seem to happen so quickly that we don't realize it's happening. Right? So if faith in meaning is not justified, the language game shifts in a moment. You go from where you were to somewhere else. You have to correct a bunch of false memories in this as well. So sometimes new unforeseen meaning pops out as a consequence, and this meta meaning escapes the bounds of its very content and preordained content to how the vehicle content pairing was used unfaithfully now, right? This is a complication of a very different kind. Therefore, the categories of environmental or natural information, or really environmental natural data, and tinformation are justly made methodologically distinct and should not be used interchangeably in arguments. And the corollary is any data, and it doesn't always have to be the natural, like the not adulterated data, but it just needs not to be intentionally spoofed. But this natural or other data derived for original intentionality, be it ours or just of a cell, is always interpretable to information, but derived data is not necessarily, tends to not be, right? So it's only the derived forms that would lie in this way, although mimicry is going to turn out to blend here. So it's fractal, it's complex, and not in any way logic is going to get to. So these terms represent distinct subcategories, right? And strictly delineated technical uses. So tinformation alone is the linchpin in providing accounts of how non-intentional sensation in being formed by mutual data, right? And this is from my other works, which explains the process of how communication might take place in these non-intentional Shannon terms, right? There's a lot of theoretical complexity I'm glossing over here. But this tinformation is the thing that drives perception, right? It's there's something about perception that's getting us to true information, in spite of the hacking, maybe because of the hacking. But it's always going to be a para kind of analysis, right? There's always a residue of the false in perceptive truths, unfortunately, and this is supposed to be why science is superior epistemically, because it's supposed to have solved this problem, but I don't think it has. So sources of data disposed for original intentionality may come from natural objects or human artifacts, right? So a bacterium may get tinformation from the material supervenance base of a piece of paper with words on it. It simply has no way to get the derived data out as a meaning encoded in language. But it's right there. It can get other information. Maybe the ink is toxic and the bacteria samples it in some way, and then avoidance ensues. And so there's information abstracted from this piece of paper at a whole other level. Right? So a lot of what we call information is not information. So it's not information at all. It's not true information. So it's just derived data tied to false expectations and false interpretations. And I think this goes on a lot more than people are willing to admit. But I think this problem is fatal, and ultimately, what we're going to need is not this grounding in some fundamental kind of data on Floridy's analysis, mine or anybody else's, but there's a regress of a sense that play out over these para-ortho models, these turtles up and down that I'm talking about, that I provide the basic motivation for in the fracture, and we're working towards their explicit expression in the diagrams after this. So I'm going to stop this video here. So this ends part one of what's going to be a two-part video. So this is going to end up being the metaphysical cartoon video for diagram for part A. Don't go away. I will stop this and let it render to a file, but then I'm going to time travel a little bit, maybe have a bite, and tackle the rest of this part of the cartoon / comic book. All right, we'll see you shortly.